Well, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to do this evening is tell you a little bit about the Oil Spill Commission that I've served on for the last 6 or 7 months. I'm going to talk a bit about what our findings were and our recommendations. And more specifically, I will then end with a discussion of how it may affect those of us who live in Alaska and those of us who care about the Arctic. So that's my general plan for the evening, and I do want to save enough time for questions because I suspect that there will be some. But I want to start by going back to the day when I was sitting at my desk at UAA in Anchorage, and my assistant walked into my office and she said, "Fran, there's a call for you on line 1. It's the White House." And honestly, when she did that, I thought she was kidding. I mean, I really did. I thought that was pretty funny. And she said, "No, really, it's the White House." So I picked up line 1. And it was quite a surprise to get a call from the White House personnel office letting me know that President Obama was asking me to serve on the Oil Spill Commission. And let me just say that that came as something of a surprise. I knew that he had created a commission primarily to look at what happened and to make recommendations about how to change business in the future, but I really didn't think I would be getting that phone call. As it was explained to me, the purpose for having a commission basically made up of a wide variety of people with very different backgrounds, different perspectives, and admittedly having someone from Alaska who had lived through the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I was in the legislature at the time of that spill. I was on the legislative committee that investigated and made recommendations about that spill. And having someone who I guess also was tied to a place where there would be probably a lot of oil and gas activity long into the future helped me better think through what it was that I could possibly bring to the commission. But actually, I think what it turned out that I was able to most help with was being a conduit of information between Alaskans and the people of the Gulf, and between folks who, for a wide variety of reasons here in Alaska, people who had responded to the oil spill in 1989, people at the university who have done a lot of research in terms of the ecosystem and oil spill response, people who lived in the communities most impacted by the Exxon Valdez, and the experience of the regional citizens advisory committees and other ways in which Alaska learned from that spill and adapted to it and went forward in a way that actually improved the safety of shipping oil out of Prince William Sound. I think it was being able to be a link between the people who needed that information, both the other commissioners and federal agencies and the people of the Gulf of Mexico, and those of you who in Alaska were very, very generous with your ideas and suggestions and testimony and personal life experiences that got shared as the commission went through its effort. So I'd just like to begin this evening by publicly acknowledging the fact that many Alaskans contributed in a variety of ways, some on the record and some off the record. And I also want to thank the University of Alaska, the President, the Board of Regents, for providing the support necessary for me to take the time to serve in this capacity during the months basically between July and January. So what was the commission? Let me start by saying that the Deepwater Horizon was a trauma that unquestionably impacted not only the region but the entire nation, and shook the confidence of Americans in not only the industry but also in government's ability to respond. So understandably, the President decided that a commission made up of 7 citizens, a bipartisan commission with both Republicans and Democrats, co-chaired by Bob Graham, who is the former United States Senator from Florida and former Governor of Florida, and Bill Riley, a Republican who served in the first President Bush's term as director of the head of EPA, and actually was serving during the Exxon Valdez oil spill for part of that period of time. So the 7 of us were charged by the president with these 2 responsibilities. 1, what went wrong? What were the fundamental underlying root causes of this catastrophe? And secondly, moving forward into the future, knowing that there will be oil and gas development and there will be deep water oil and gas development, not only in the Gulf of Mexico but elsewhere, what can we as a nation do to improve the record of safety and really aspire toward being the best as we could possibly be in assuring the kind of safe operations that the nation expects? So that was our mission. And I will say, if I can get this to work, the tricky part was we were given only 6 months to do that. Now 6 months sounds sort of like a long time, but for purposes of an investigation along the lines of what was required of the commission, and to really do due diligence from the standpoint of listening to the wide array of experts that came to not only testify, but that we used as experts who helped the commission do its work. 6 months actually was a pretty quick turnaround, but we did it. And on January 11th, we submitted our report. We met personally with the president in the White House and had the opportunity to discuss the report with him and with his cabinet, the part of the cabinet that was most directly involved in responding to the spill. So as I mentioned to Brian this afternoon, we were kind of unusual in that the commission finished on time, under budget, and with a unanimous decision. And in this day and age, that's rare. We had our first meeting in New Orleans. We met in New Orleans in July because, of course, that's sort of the very focused spot where many of the people who were most impacted by the spill felt the need to hear from us, to tell us what they thought, and so we had a very large public hearing in New Orleans, standing room only. And it will probably not surprise you if you think about it, but it did sort of surprise me at first. As I listened to the testimony and as I got to know the people of the Gulf Coast region, I saw this amazing similarity between Alaska and Louisiana. I know, take that on board for just a moment. Oil and gas, fishing, tourism, a tremendous attachment to the special place, reliance on being able to hunt and fish and use the waters and the coastlines, cultural traditions associated with all of those things. Doesn't that sound like Alaska? That's Louisiana. So obviously, you know, the temperatures and the terrain just a little bit different. But in terms of the economy, in terms of the society, in terms of what's important politically, in reaching a balance between having a very clean and sustainable environment, but also having a vibrant industry, oil and gas, fishing, tourism, that have to live side by side. That's what we heard as we had our first hearing in New Orleans. Not only concern about the spill, but concern about whether there would be continued oil and gas development, whether the moratorium that had been announced would slow down the jobs in that region. What would be the long-term health impacts associated with the spill, or for the people who are out on the beaches cleaning up the spill, what would be their long-term health implications? And of course, again, for those of you who were around during the Exxon Valdez, doesn't this sound familiar in terms of the concerns that people had and the long-lasting implications to the economy, to the social structure, and to health? So we held our meetings, we listened, we hired staff, and we went about the business of trying to look at not only the root cause, but also recommendations that we might make in the future. So let me spend a few moments talking about the root cause. Our job was not to find liability or find fault in the same way that The lawsuits that are underway will do. That wasn't our job. Our job was to look more at the system. What is it that can give rise to this situation where a very, very complex and highly technologically sophisticated industry, like deep water oil and gas drilling is, have a mistake, have a series of mistakes, and have a tragedy that claimed the lives of 11 men on that rig and injured dozens others, and of course ends up having spilled somewhere in the neighborhood, and of course this number is in dispute, somewhere around 200 million gallons of oil. Well, this was, in our opinion, a completely preventable accident. Process safety is a well-defined and fairly well-developed system of managing risk and incorporating business practices that encourage, as a matter of fact, demand safety at all levels of an organization. And unfortunately, what we found was a lack of process safety, a lack of communication, a lack of management, and the kind of assessment of risk and integration of the risk of that particular well, that rig, the workers on board, and the systems that you would like to have had in place that would have triggered warning signs about the multiple failures that had taken place in the last 24 hours before the rig blew. We found that it was really not appropriate to think of this as a black swan event, a one-time only event. If you think about the companies involved, BP, Transocean, Halliburton, these are the largest in the world. BP is the largest operator in the Gulf of Mexico, Halliburton and Transocean, the largest operators for rigs in the world. It is inconceivable that this was simply there. And particularly, if you look at the numbers of what was going on in the Gulf of Mexico, let me give you a data point. Between 1996 and 2009, there were 79 loss of control incidents in the Gulf of Mexico. That's another word for blowout. It just doesn't necessarily mean big blowout. It just means loss of control. And we could spend time talking about all of that. But what the point is, 79 incidents during that period of time could have turned into fires, explosions, significant spills. The Gulf of Mexico death rate is 4 times higher for drilling rig workers than it is in the North Sea. And the North Sea is a much more challenging work environment than the Gulf of Mexico is. There are other indicators that we looked at that convinced us that there are system changes that need to be made, and need to be made both by industry and by the regulators if we want to improve the safety of operations, particularly in deep water drilling. The industry has made changes. The government has already made changes. But there are others that we feel need to be made. And let me just talk briefly about the general categories of recommendations that we make in our report. Improving the safety culture of offshore operations. And as I said, that involves both industry and government doing business differently. Safeguarding the environment. The decision making that takes place in the 5-year leasing, the planning process, the individual permit decisions, that needs to integrate the expertise that exists in agencies like NOAA, like EPA, like USGS, the composite of agencies within the federal government that have had, in some cases, a fairly limited role in influencing decisions made by the Minerals Management Service, old MMS, which is now the Bureau of Oceans and Energy Management, or BOEM, BOMRA. It's called many different things. But we make specific recommendations about how to assure that science and expertise from the agencies that can actually add value to the decision making by the Department of Interior be incorporated in a more effective way. Strengthening spill response planning and capacity. And I'll talk more about what we learned, both in terms of spill response in this case and the lack of containment capacity, but also some of the recommendations about how to improve that situation. Restoring the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know, how many of you have ever lived anywhere near the Gulf of Mexico? Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas. Raise your hand if you have. There are a few of you. I'll admit to not knowing a whole lot about the Gulf of Mexico until fairly recently, and so most of what I have learned is still fairly superficial. But this is a region that actually had a pretty severely compromised ecosystem even before the oil spill, for a variety of reasons that we won't have a lot of time to go into tonight. But it is a place that needs attention, needs restoration, and it is important. It's a national treasure. It's a national asset, and it's extremely important from the standpoint of the Mississippi River, which comes out into the Gulf of Mexico and is a very important transportation corridor for the entire Midwest. Basically, if you think about the industrial and agricultural Midwest, their road to the world is the Mississippi River. And the ability to make certain that the Mississippi River corridor remains healthy enough to be long into the future a transportation mechanism for the people of our nation is something that I don't think we think about much sitting here in Alaska, probably any more than people in Louisiana spend time, very much time thinking about the Arctic and what's going on in the Arctic. But having said that, it is important. So how we restore the Gulf of Mexico, how we protect those wetlands, and frankly, how we do what is necessary by way of anticipating and allowing the natural environment to be a buffer for the hurricanes that hit the coast is a piece of our recommendations as well. Ensuring financial responsibility and anticipating what will be required in frontier areas like the Arctic. That sort of summarizes the topics that are addressed in our recommendations. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about each of those, and then I'll try to not talk too much longer because I want to save a lot of time for questions. So preventing accidents and changing government. Let's talk about the role of government in making a safer operation. We have proposed that the Department of Interior restructure the old Minerals Management Service, now BOEM, and the Secretary of Interior about 2 weeks ago announced the additional details associated with the recommendations that they have taken on board and the extent to which they have made those reorganization plans happen, we're very, very pleased with. What was particularly important to us was separating out the safety responsibility from the leasing responsibility from the revenue and accounting responsibilities. Now you might ask yourself, why is that so important? All of those things were sort of balled up together in MMS. And from everything that we learned and the testimony we received, including from people who worked for MMS or for the industry for many years, it made it pretty clear that many of those missions were pretty confusing and sent different messages about how to prioritize the choices that were being made within MMS. And as it might not surprise you, revenue is a pretty important thing to agencies. As a matter of fact, it's a pretty important thing to governments. So the pressure's kind of always there to go get that extra dollar, go get that extra lease, go make it happen. There's nothing wrong with that as long as it's balanced appropriately with other concerns about the environment, concerns about safe operation, and separating those functions we felt was a pretty important piece of it, and they are doing that. Another very important part of what we think will provide a safer operating procedure also relates to how government challenges industry to develop its safe operations in the regulatory process. And let me describe for you just a moment what I mean by that. In Norway and in UK, they take a very different approach to how they regulate offshore oil and gas drilling than we do. Instead of what we would call a kind of a prescriptive approach, which is, how many fire extinguishers do you have? They take an approach which they refer to as a safety case, in which what they mean by that is that for each well, and for each rig, there is an assessment of the risk of that particular well, so that you can actually determine, based on the geology, the depth, the amount of water, the sophistication of the equipment you're using, the number of different companies that are involved. And on some of these rigs, you have a couple dozen different companies, contractors, subcontractors, all trying to work together as a team, not always well, as it turns out on the Deepwater Horizon. So the safety case approach to regulation, which is kind of a regime shift in how you think about regulating and providing the safest possible operation, really requires a set of companies, when they come together to do business on a particular well, on a particular rig, to develop the methodology, the process safety, the way of communicating to assure that for those sets of circumstances and for those people, they're very clear about who's responsible for what and what the provisions will be in case of emergencies in terms of how you're going to handle the risk that you are dealing with. And let me just give you a tiny glimpse into the Deepwater Horizon final 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours. Within the last week, on the Deepwater Horizon rig, the temporary abandonment procedure, which is the shutting down until they would come on later and actually develop that rig, the plan for that temporary abandonment was changed 4 times in the last week, including the last version of it the morning of the blowout. So try to imagine yourself on a rig out in the middle of the water with a whole bunch of people. Everybody's got little pieces of the job to do. You're focused on yours. The rules keep changing. The plan is changing even up until that morning. And how do you fit together the risk of a particular action or even a particular indicator on a bunch of gauges as to how that fits together with the other pieces of the operation on that rig, so that you can actually evaluate whether you should be blowing the whistle and saying, stop, you're in trouble. I know this is a little hard to describe in a setting like this in the amount of time we have, but let me just say that the approach of a safety case regulatory regime requires management and communication at a very different level, and it's why Norway and UK have evolved it and have a better safety record than we have as a country. And we're just saying we can learn from peer countries. We don't necessarily have all the answers. They maybe don't have all the answers either. But we believe there has to be a shift in how we proceed with not only regulating but operating in deep water. So there are things I could talk more about, the other recommendations for how government needs to change, but let me just explain why this graph is important. It's not just MMS's fault that over the years they were taking a more complacent, we would describe perhaps, to industry, too much a part of industry. There have been lots of commentary about that they were sort of captive. Let me just say what this chart shows you is the rapid rate of growth in rigs and oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico and the flat funding for the regulatory agency. That's that gray line. So at the very time that the activity in the Gulf was exploding, particularly in the higher risk areas of deep water, MMS was being starved of resources necessary to really do an adequate job of regulating. And frankly, we perhaps all should take some responsibility. Congress should take some responsibility. Several different administrations should take some responsibility for not giving to the agencies that we expect will be there trying to assure safety the kind of training, expertise, financial support, and frankly, political support to do the kind of regulatory, the kind of regulation that would really improve the odds of safe operations. So let's talk a little bit about industry. We are recommending that the oil and gas industry adopt a safety institute that is completely separate and apart from government, but that it is an industry run by industry, financed by industry, that's about industry setting high standards for itself, where peer review, best practices, and the opportunity to kind of grade each other might help the industry all go toward the very best they can be. We looked at the nuclear industry, which is another high-risk industry, as a model for how that might work. The nuclear industry created its own safety institute. It is completely separate and apart from government. But they actually have a professional staff that grades the nuclear plants in this country. And guess what? The insurance rate that those nuclear plants pay is a function of the grade they get. So it has consequences. And that exact approach may not be the right approach for the oil and gas industry, but something like that, that allows the industry itself to reach up instead of just sort of saying business as usual is sufficient, and have safety as the premium, not just productivity, not just profit, not just speed, all of which, of course, are significant drivers in any private sector operation. We also talk about the importance of raising the liability cap. Currently, it is set at 75 million, which of course is hopelessly too low. That was set in shortly after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in OPA 90. So it's out of date, both from the standpoint of the value of a dollar. It's out of date from the standpoint of what it really costs. And we think it's out of date in terms of setting a standard of liability that really provides another incentive for industry to do the best job they possibly can to be as safe as possible. Let's keep moving. Let's talk now about response and containment. When the Deepwater Horizon rig and the Macondo well received all of the necessary permitting years ago, and all of that was in motion, the companies said that they had the capacity to contain a major spill. And of course, what we learned last summer is none of the companies doing business in the Gulf of Mexico had the necessary technology to contain a spill of that size. And so what happened was, sort of on the fly, industry and government did their very best in a relatively short period of time to do what they could to contain the spill. And I do want to give credit to people in the industry and in the federal agencies for being very innovative and doing their best under very difficult conditions to come up with a system that would work and that would provide some relief from the spill. But what we need to do as a country and as an industry is get ahead of the game, both from the standpoint of prevention, from containing if there is, and ultimately being able to pick up any oil if there's a spill. We are unquestionably behind. It was quite surprising to me that as I thought about how I saw people in Prince William Sound cleaning up the oil spill, you know, it's the same set of tools. You can use berms, you can do skimming, you can do burning, you can use dispersants. You know, I mean, it's the same toolkit that we had in 1989 is what was used in the Gulf of Mexico. In some cases, it was a little bit different. I mean, admittedly, the dispersant use in the Gulf of Mexico was quite a bit different than the way in which dispersants have been used on the surface or in coastal areas. That was unique. Whether or not it was a good idea, I mean, people have differing opinions about that. It clearly kept the oil off the beaches, and it certainly kept it off the surface, which from the standpoint of bird life, turtles, shore, coastal impacts was probably a good thing. But basically the toolkit is the same. There has not been the kind of investment by either government or industry in oil spill cleanup technology that we really need. And we are, of course, recommending that there be a significant effort, both in terms of a financial commitment and a national commitment, that we will both from the standpoint of containment and response capacity really improve what we are doing. Now again, I want to credit the industry. Several of the major oil companies have come together to form a group to develop a containment strategy that would work in the Gulf of Mexico. It's probably another year away from actually being able to be up and operating, but you know, there are companies stepping up to the plate and saying we want to take the initiative and be prepared so that if there is another incident, we're in a better position than we were the last time around. But there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, obviously, both by industry and by government. Well, let's talk a bit about restoration of the Gulf and the need to really allocate funds to do what needs to be done for both deep water, for blue water, as well as for shore and coastline restoration. The Commission recommended using 80% of the Clean Water Act penalties for Gulf restoration. Instead of that money simply going into the federal treasury, it really should go back to the region that was most impacted by this catastrophe. A lot of that is Louisiana, but it's also Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and Florida. Clearly, because of the location of the spill and the nature of the Gulf Coast ecosystem, Louisiana will end up presumably with a lot of the funds going to the coastal wetlands, and that's appropriate, but there are many other things as well that need to be done. This area is used for many purposes. And so thinking through a restoration strategy based on the industrial uses and the need for preservation and restoration is not an easy thing. It's a complicated thing. But this region actually does have in place a number of regional restoration plans, again, that were prepared not because of an oil spill, but were prepared because of the long-term and rather significant deterioration of the health of that ecosystem over many years. So there are plans in place. What has been missing is funding. And if there is one silver lining associated with a disaster like this, because of the natural resources damages that will come as a result of the NERDA process, and because of the penalties that will come from the Clean Water Act violations, there will be funds. And we are encouraging Congress to appropriate those funds for this purpose. You know, I could talk quite a bit, and I don't think I have time to do so, about the many, many implications for turtles, for wildlife, for the people of the Gulf. It is a sad time and a sad place for them in the same way it was a sad time and a sad place for us in Alaska. And it will take a long time to recover, both physically, biologically, emotionally, from the standpoint of the ecosystem, and for some, at least, from the standpoint of their economy. That's certainly true for the oyster farmers. It will be a long time before the oyster farmers of Louisiana can really feel as though they're back to where they were. But I think the good news is that if the funding that is available is used appropriately for restoration, there can actually be an improvement in this region over the long term, and that's what we have to hope for. Okay, well, finally, let me talk a bit about frontier areas, including the Arctic. Again, if we go back to the original Commission assignment, not just look at the Deepwater Horizon, but also look at the future and what can we do to make it safer, there was nothing in the language from the President's charge to the Commission that specifically said look at the Arctic. But as we looked at frontier areas, areas that are seriously under consideration or under current permits to move forward with oil and gas development in the OCS, clearly Alaska was right there in front of us. And the Commission felt that it was important that we address the Arctic, but not that we try to substitute our judgment as a Commission for individual decisions associated with particular projects or particular permits. That wasn't our job, It was not either what we were asked to do or what we had the time or the capacity to do. So our recommendations are bigger picture, long-term, not specific to anything that is currently pending in Alaska. Well, first and foremost, we focused on the fact that the Arctic is not just the United States Arctic. It's not just Alaska. It is all of the regions of the Arctic. So whether it's Russia or Canada or Greenland or Norway or us, there is likely to be increased development in this region. Not only oil and gas, but shipping and tourism and all kinds of things that require us as people who care about the long-term well-being of the Arctic to think ahead of decisions that are being made. In other words, anticipate what we will need to really be prepared for the activities of the Arctic and do it in a much more expedited way in a time sense than has been. Let's get on with it. And what do we need to get on with? The research. Now, clearly a lot of research has already been done, so I don't want to suggest by my remarks that we were ignorant of that. As a matter of fact, I spent the afternoon at the University of Alaska Fairbanks today with Brian and with many of his incredible research team who focus all the time on the Arctic. And a lot of work has been done not only by the academics, but also by agencies, by the industry. The question is, to what extent is the research integrated and focused in ways that help us really understand the big picture of how the ecosystem works, so that if in fact there is a disaster of any kind and you actually try to restore back to the original state, you have to know what that state was. If you try to do damage assessment of natural resources, you have to know what the natural resources were. If you want to make good public policy decisions about what regions to develop and what regions not to, or what areas to particularly protect because they're fishery nursery areas or whatever, you need to integrate that information in a way that makes it possible for decision makers to link up what is known with the choices that need to be made. So we recommend a comprehensive research on the Arctic to better understand the ecosystem, additional research on response, both containment and oil spill response in the Arctic in ice, knowing that we know that we do know that this area poses unique and special challenges, very different than cleaning up oil when there isn't ice. We recommend that the Coast Guard receive the kind of investment so that they can have assets necessary for response, not just for oil and gas, but for all the possible responses that would be required of the Coast Guard, search and rescue and all of the other ways in which we who live in Alaska rely on the Coast Guard, but we know that they are not able because they don't have the capacity at this point in time to do what people would expect them to be able to do in the Arctic. And finally, we recommended that the Arctic nations come together and think through the best practices, the best technology for doing oil and gas in the Arctic. So whether you're doing it in Norway or doing it in Russia or doing it in Alaska, that we have some standards, both from the standpoint of technology, but also from the standpoint of, not only the drilling technology, but also the oil spill response technology and the training, so that we're working together as nations that share a common and very special region, as opposed to kind of everybody doing their own thing. The good news is there are efforts underway, both from the standpoint of setting technical standards, but also from the standpoint of international cooperation. The Arctic Council will be meeting in a couple months to actually focus on this question. We recommend that the United States take a leadership role in this, so that the Arctic as a whole is embraced as a special region deserving of investment, deserving of best practices that are appropriate to the special challenges of the Arctic, so that as things develop and as development takes place, we have a higher level of confidence that it will be done in the safest way possible. I think I will stop there. I will close simply by saying the Commission has finished its work. In addition to the meeting that we had In the White House on January 11th, we went back to the region. We went back to New Orleans. We fanned out and went to Louisiana and Alabama and Texas and Florida and Mississippi and talked with the people who we had originally talked with shortly after the commission started, so that we could report back to them what we've learned, what we found, what our recommendations were, to give them the assurance that even though our work was finished and our report was done, that each of us individually, the 7 of us, feel a certain commitment to the effort to continue, not officially as a commission because we don't have the power to do that, but individually to reach out and communicate the findings and recommendations, to testify before Congress when called, and to do something else. A year from now, do a report card on how industry and government have responded. What have they done? How many of the recommendations that we've put on the table have actually happened? And if they haven't happened, what else has happened? Or have we missed the opportunity to use this event to change the safety culture of the industry? Have we missed the event, the opportunity that this event provided us to really reach toward being the best in the world, the safest in the world, the most responsible in the world, as opposed to simply business as usual? So a year from now, we'll do our report card, and my hope is that we as a nation will be able to say, as we were able to say after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, that it made a difference in a positive way. Do you remember what changed after the Exxon Valdez oil spill? Double hull tankers, increased escort vessels in and out of Prince William Sound, so tankers were not alone anymore. Depots with adequate supplies throughout the coastline area so that we were ready to respond. Twice a year training for oil spill responders so that they are ready if they are needed. I could go on and on. These are things that did not exist before the Exxon Valdez and that exist today because we learned from our mistakes. That's my hope. That is my hope, that this experience will enable the United States to learn and move forward in a way that increases our confidence, both in the industry and in government. Thank you very much. And oh, by the way, this is the full report, and it's 380 pages. And it is available online. You can get an iPad version or a Kindle version if you want to. And it's really a good read, and I know that sounds crazy because you have to you say to yourself, how can a big, thick book be a good read? But we had some amazing writers that actually tell the story in a way that makes it a fun read. And this is the short version, which just basically addresses very specifically the recommendations as opposed to the findings and the full report. They are both available online, and you can go to oilspillcommission.gov. Okay, so we have a few questions.
You can just raise your hand. Okay.
Yes, Fran, thank you very much. Wonder if you could comment. I have an impression from the Exxon Valdez oil spill and from the deepwater oil spill of the Gulf of Mexico that prior to these events, maybe people didn't do as good a job as they could have at identifying and including the stakeholders who should have been involved. Maybe that's not accurate, but I think there was a surprise factor. You know, where are all these fishermen in Prince William Sound coming from? When were they overlooked so that we didn't hear from them? Same with the states and the fishermen and the tourism industry in the Gulf of Mexico. Maybe you'd like to set me straight.
Actually, your instincts are accurate. The frustration that we heard in the region was pretty surprising, as in, what do you mean seen this oil spill response plan says X, Y, and Z. I mean, the extent to which local people had not engaged, or perhaps been asked to engage. I'm not sure what the right verb tense is there. How much of it was people didn't choose to because they didn't think it would ever really happen, or how much of it was they really didn't know how to engage in the planning process, or were they not really invited in a way that made them feel welcome? I don't know. But people of the Gulf were very frustrated about how little they knew about how the oil spill cleanup would work. They were very frustrated by the fact that there wasn't enough boom. They were very frustrated that the communication about how much oil is actually coming out and who's in charge, and there was a lot of frustration. And yes, I do think a piece of that is the front-end stakeholder involvement communication piece, that for one reason or another, I think we have a much better situation here, partially because of the Regional Citizens Advisory Committees, the RCACs, that were put in place in OPA 90 for Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet. Now, not for the entire state, not for the Arctic, just for those two areas, but you have an ongoing engagement with citizens as a result of those RCACs that really helps open up the dialogue between industry regulators and local people. And we recommend in our report that there be a Gulf of Mexico Citizens Advisory Committee, or probably because of multiple states, they'll probably have to have a few, with maybe all coming up together toward, one umbrella. But both from the standpoint of oil spill preparedness and the developing of those plans and the ability to respond if there is an incident and people know kind of what their job is or where they go or who they can relate to so that they don't feel so frustrated, it is an important piece of the puzzle. And there are a couple of things that we recommend, both from the standpoint of how oil spill planning gets done by the federal agencies, how that gets coordinated, and frankly a requirement that there be public notice so that the public can comment on draft oil spill plans, which currently in federal law there is no such requirement. So I mean, there are lots of pieces of what you generally describe as citizen engagement and lack thereof. So there are pieces of it: the planning process, the training process, RCACs for the Gulf of Mexico, and frankly, from the standpoint of the federal agencies, a clearer way of integrating all of the federal agencies that play a role in oil spill planning and response, which is something of a mishmash because there are several levels of planning. And particularly when you have a spill of national significance and you get the incident command system rolling in, and it becomes pretty complicated pretty fast. And we make a few recommendations about how we think that could be simplified. Other questions?
Hi, my question is, I was reading an article a few years ago, and it was talking about some oil-eating bacteria that is being developed or studied in use for cleanup of oil spills. Do you know where we are with that technology and whether or not it can be used on a wide scale spread at this point or not?
There are probably a couple of experts from UAF in this room tonight who can speak about it better than I can. But, microbes, they're fabulous. I mean, let me back up and say that, there's a lot of information out there in the press about the extent to which the oil in the Gulf of Mexico disappeared. And of course, what we really know is that the microbes and the natural process of actually, considering oil food, I know that sounds crazy, but that is in fact what happened. Whether or not you can stimulate that, or whether simply the fact that in the Gulf of Mexico, because you had natural oil seeps that for many, many, many centuries probably provided the natural culture necessary to have the expansion of the ability of the natural ecosystem to basically absorb a lot of that oil. There's questions, and we heard a little bit about it this afternoon at UAF, about the extent to which that would work in the Arctic where water temperatures are different. But UAF has researchers that are actually looking at that question of the extent to which how that would be different in the Arctic versus in the Gulf of Mexico.
We have another question over here.
Brian, who was that would talk to that issue today? I don't want to put you on the spot, but. It was Bob Perkins and Mary Beth Lee. Well, why don't you give him a microphone? Todd, would you just talk a little bit about that? Because you've got some great folks at UAF that are very focused on these questions.
Yes, actually they're doing the study up in Barrow because that's where they get access to the marine water. And the comments today were pretty much, we have to work in a cold water system because a lot of the standards for these assessments are, as we learned today, 70-degree water, which doesn't apply to Alaska. And so using invertebrates and vertebrates as models to test for toxicity, we have to do it with species that are relevant to the Arctic. We have to do it with conditions that are relevant to the Arctic, so we have to use the right water, the right temperatures. And then Mary Beth Lee is looking at how dispersants and the oil spill interact with the microbes. And she said today that it doesn't appear the dispersant inhibits the microbes in degrading the hydrocarbons. And so my guess is her next series of tests are going to be maybe the dispersants help. The idea being if the dispersant dissolves the oil in the water, the microbes might be able to work on it more quickly. But then we get into whether the oil is going into areas that have oxygen and no oxygen, and that's where she's going to be going too, is looking at aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. There's a lot to do yet, but I agree the microbes could play a big role, and she also does research on land where she actually will fertilize systems to enhance the microbes so that their degradation of contaminants will increase. Like for PCBs, she works on PCBs. Can I stop?
Thank you. Thank you for adding value. Anyone else?
In regards to the Exxon spill in Alaska, you mentioned that we use most of the same toolkit for response and containment to this spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Realistically, how much of your suggestions do you think they'll implement, and how long do you think it'll take?
Oh, I wish I had a crystal ball that was clear enough to answer those questions. Wow, you know, some of the things are actually already being implemented. Okay, so the reorganization in Department of Interior, increasing some of the risk management, the risk assessment and risk management. The Department of Interior adopted some regulations, they're called the SEMS regs, back in September, that go in that direction. The industry is, both the American Petroleum Institute and individual companies are having conversations about the kind of independent industry-led safety institute that I mentioned. So they're talking about how they might do that and whether it would look exactly like what we would suggest or something different, whether it's going to be under API or whether it's going to be a separate organization. I mean, but there's conversation about that. Congress is currently debating the $75 million limit liability cap and trying to raise that cap. There's discussions with Senators Begich and Murkowski and Mary Landrieu from Louisiana about some sort of a compromise that would raise the limit but not make it unrealistic for small or medium-sized oil and gas companies to be able to participate, some sort of a pool. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are things in motion, and so I'm reasonably hopeful that some of those things will actually happen, and will happen like within a year or so. Other things, for example, are recommendations about forward funding research for oil spill response and containment. That's an appropriation issue. So in a Congress that is seemingly very preoccupied with cutting the budget, will they realize that this is an important piece of our responsibility? I don't know, maybe. As Bob Graham, the co-chair of the commission, the former Florida U.S. Senator and former Florida Governor, has pointed out on several occasions, OCS resources belong to the people of the United States. They don't belong to the oil and gas industry. They belong to you and me. They're ours. So we have an ownership obligation to take care of these resources and to manage them wisely, and a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that those people who are lucky enough to get to develop them safely and wisely. So in that line of thinking, investing in things like research and development for safety, for oil spill response, for containment, would be just part of good business practices if we as a country were a company. So I think you can make a strong case to do those things. Whether or not that will be appealing this year under all the political conditions, I don't know. That kind of goes back to why we thought we'd do a report card in a year to kind of just say, okay, how'd you do? How'd you do Congress? How'd you do President? How'd you do Secretary of Interior? How'd you do oil and gas industry? And do a little bit of a comparison. I guess we all ought to just keep our fingers crossed.
We have a question over here.
I was pleased with your comments toward the end discussing the role of possibly more with working with the Arctic countries, going international. And I think it's good that you're posing that, because it's such a hard idea to think that we will go beyond our own national borders to find a solution. I know some years ago I had the good fortune of interviewing George Rogers when he was doing some fisheries work in the North Pacific, and he was called to meet with Pierre Trudeau because the people in interior Canada were concerned about international fisheries and Alaskans getting all the salmon before they could return up the Skeena and the rivers into Canada. And they got all the scientists together and they really had a big powwow, but he said they came to the decision not to do anything because the public had no idea about the idea of ecology or of salmon that would go through international waters and what portion should go back to Canada. And he said it was a calculated discussion not to do anything because that idea was not in the people's heads yet. And it took about 30 years for that to actually come into being. And I just wonder if we're not facing the same thing when we're talking about working across the Arctic with other countries that have their own versions of private industry and of government regulation. Because we've got to look other places to find solutions, and we don't have it wrapped up ourselves, that's for sure.
Well, George Rogers was a wonderful man and a very special Alaskan who provided leadership in many different ways. So I'm not surprised to hear that he was kind of ahead of his time in trying to get people to think more globally and try to think beyond borders. It would be classic George Rogers to have done that years before other people even knew the right language to use about those concepts. But I put this back up there just to remind us that, you know, the Arctic isn't a place where boundaries are all that clear. I'll bet, you know, you know that Greenland's there and you sort of know where Norway and Sweden is, but you know, the rest of it's kind of just one big area. And I'm hopeful that we can get the people of the North to think about our mutual responsibilities to each other and to this place so that we can provide more of the long-term 21st century international vision kind of leadership than maybe what was more fitting for the old 20th century thinking about boundaries. Now I realize that that's probably optimistic, but I try to be, because if you don't think about it that way, it gets very depressing very quickly. I do think there's an opportunity in the Arctic because we already have some mechanisms in place. The Arctic Council is a place where the countries of the North have come together over the last 10, almost 15 years to talk about common problems, common issues, do research together in kind of a team approach. And although it doesn't have power, it doesn't have, like, you know, treaty responsibility, it is a vehicle, a forum, a place where people can share and come together. And there's, I think, a growing awareness because of the ice receding and because of the warming of the Arctic, and because how these issues, whether it's oil and gas development or navigation issues, are going to impact all of the countries of the Arctic. I think there's maybe more of an opportunity at this moment in time for us to do something much more proactive than simply reactive, and use the people of the North as kind of the common bond, the common vision. That's my hope anyway. That is my hope. Maybe one last question. You've all been a wonderful, patient, quiet, attentive audience. I appreciate it, but maybe just one more question, we'll call it a night. Yes? The last part of your question is what? I'm sorry? There is a technical team that has been hired specifically to look at the BOP, the blowout preventer, which, of course, because of not only our time constraint of 6 months, but also because there is a specific team tasked to do that, we didn't do that. In some ways, it doesn't matter, because as the oil and gas industry will tell you, a system of a temporary abandonment of a well that actually has to rely on the BOP functioning is a well that has failed, and a rig that has failed, and a management system that has failed. In a temporary abandonment procedure, you want to have 2 or 3 barriers. And of course, drilling mud and a variety of other techniques are used to assure the kind of pressure necessary to control a well from blowing out. The BOP is the last line of defense, not the first. So yes, it's important to know why it failed, but any operation that really counts on that as being the mechanism that you would use routinely, most BOPs have never been used. We were fascinated to find out how little technology has developed to actually determine from an instrumentation perspective whether or not a pretty large and very complex organizational piece of the equipment like the BOP, whether or not even the battery is functioning. There's a question as to whether or not one of the batteries in one of the pieces of how the BOP worked was actually dead or not. And not to have enough sophisticated instrumentation to be able to tell you up on the rig whether or not that battery was functioning or not, it gives you some indication of the extent to which systems failures are what we need to come to understand as not only what caused this particular blowout, but that is putting at risk deep water oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico and actually around the world. So at some point, the technical team that has spent time and money investigating and trying to pull apart the BOP's failure, at some point we'll know that. But in terms of what caused this blowout, it was not a malfunctioning BOP. That was sort of the last problem. There was cementing. There was 1 barrier instead of 3 barriers. There were a lot of specific things, and actually on one of the pages of, I used to remember which page number it was. I think it's actually 78. But we have a list of 12 failures, any one of which on that rig that day should have been enough to tell the people who worked on that rig that they should stop the temporary abandonment procedure and put a hold on it until they knew exactly what the risk was. Any one of those 12 should have been enough, including the final tests that actually showed the pressure which failed 3 times. And on the 4th time, they changed the way in which they did the test. And so the 4th time, the test passed, but without anybody saying, why did it fail 3 times? I mean, there were 12 of those incidents on the rig that day, any one of which should have been enough of a trigger to say, stop, time out. So a lot of popular press accounts kind of focuses on the BOP, but as I said, that's kind of an insurance. It's not the principal mechanism by which you control a well. And not to get too far down the road of technicalities, but let me just say, overall, communication, management, process safety, integration of people who are working in a very complex environment. Complex systems fail in complex ways. And unfortunately, these deep water rigs are incredibly complex operations. And unquestionably, the technology is impressive, and it has evolved in a way in the last 20 years that is really equivalent to putting a man on the moon. And we should be proud as a country. The industry is proud, should be proud, of the way in which they have been able to evolve and adapt in very difficult conditions, including these ultra deep water wells. But what we need to do is evolve the safety culture and the safety technology and the instrumentation and the testing and the training and the management and the communication systems that go along with it to have a much safer operation in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Beaufort of the Chukchi, or any place else that we do business. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, I would encourage you to go read the report. I appreciate your being here tonight. I sincerely do, and thanks to the sponsors for asking me to attend.